The GTX 960 was NVIDIA's answer to 1080p gaming back in 2015. This card was pretty reasonably priced at the time and was overall praised for achieving that goal that NVIDIA set out to do. I wanted to see how well this card performed 4 years later, and still see if that holds up in 1080p games nowadays. Now, some quick specs out of the way. This card featured 1024 CUDA cores, which was actually less than a previous generation 760. But given that this card has a lot less TDP and based on a slightly newer architecture, it not only was able to use those core more efficiently, but it had less power. This particular model is an EVGA SSC model, which stands for super clocked. A little redundant just to say that it has a higher boost clock over the base model, but hey, that's marketing for you. Now, the primary reason why it could achieve close to 1500 megahertz on boost is this ACX 2.0 cooler. It's a pretty nice cooler, features 3 copper heat pipes, 2 pretty large quiet fans that are pretty quiet under operation, and I never saw this card get past about 70 degrees C, which is pretty nice for a gaming rig. Now, the 960 did come in 2 different memory configurations throughout its life cycle. It came in a 2 or 4 gigabyte version. And unless you can find the 2 gigabyte version at a really good deal, I would probably look out for the 4 gigabyte version, as you'll see in some later benchmarks that a lot of the games actually use more than 2 gigabytes of VRAM, which, depending on the situation, could result in a loss of frame rate compared to the 4 gigabyte version. Now, being a couple generations old, this Maxwell chip is pretty readily available in the used market. You can find these anywhere on eBay or OfferUp for well under $100, which makes this a pretty good value proposition for 1080p gaming. Overall, the card performs pretty well in that 1080p medium setting sweet spot, and I was interested to see how this card would perform with those settings in some pretty modern titles. So, with specs out of the way, let's see how this card would perform benchmarks. In the Unigine Heaven benchmark, it's a pretty GPU-heavy benchmark. With the Extreme preset, we were seeing a pretty respectable average frame rate of 45 FPS with some 1% lows in the down in the 17s, which is a good baseline for this card. Now, the first game we have here is Apex Legends, 1080p medium settings, like I mentioned. And we saw some really good frame rates, averaging 63 frames a second. This game performed really well for the card and is probably a good indication that this card still has a lot of life left, even for some newer titles. Now, the next game I'm going to be showing you is Fortnite. This game runs on the Unreal Engine and favors NVIDIA cards, which works out for this pretty well. With an average frame rate of 54 FPS, this game played really smoothly on all epic settings, which is the game maxed out. On a more reasonable competitive settings, that's at 1080p medium settings with no shadows, we were seeing 114 FPS, which if you have a higher refresh rate monitor, this would pair very nicely, especially given the frame rate and the frame times. Same with Overwatch, 1080p high settings, we were seeing really high frame rates for what this card can achieve. Averaging just 101 FPS with 1% lows down in the 70s. This was a really smooth experience, definitely a win for this card. The next title we have is Black Ops 3, 1080p max settings. We are seeing really good frame rates, just averaging 74 FPS and with the 1% lows down in the 50s. This is a really smooth experience and definitely a great pairing for this card. Now, the next game I'm going to be testing here is Forza Horizon 4 at 1080p medium settings. This game performed really well, close to actually what an Xbox One X can achieve. With an average frame rate of 70 FPS, this game ran very smooth, with the one exception of, I don't know if this was on the CPU side, but there was some weird frame skips, which did lead to some stuttering, but overall, the game performed really well, especially if we capped it at 60 FPS, which performed pretty good. Now, The Witcher 3 was released the same year that this card was released, and shows exactly what NVIDIA was trying to achieve with their goal of the performance of this card. At 1080p medium settings, I saw an average of 54 FPS with some pretty good 1% and 0.1% lows. Overall, the card performed really well and actually beat a lot of console experiences, considering that with the same settings, they are capped at 30 FPS. Now, the last title I have here is the most demanding title, and that's Shadow of the Tomb Raider. At 1080p medium settings, I saw an average frame rate of 38 FPS, which is pretty on par of what the performance of this card can perform. Overall, the frame times are pretty good, and it was a pretty smooth experience, even though it was around 38 FPS. But overall, given the expectation of the performance of the card, I think it played out pretty well. So, there you have it. I do think the benchmarks kind of speak for themselves for this card, as the performance really has not changed throughout the years, but the price of this card has gotten really compelling if you're looking to build if you're looking for a graphics card well under $100. This card does have some caveats though. I wouldn't necessarily recommend the 2GB model, as a lot of these titles like Shadow of the Tomb Raider was using very close to that 4GB frame buffer, and you're going to see some dips in frames, especially if it goes well over that buffer. This card performs really well for the price, and given the right expectation, I think it's definitely worth a look at if you've got about $60-70 to play with on a graphics card. Paired pretty well with an i7 2600K non-overclocked, and would make for a pretty modest gaming machine, especially given the price point. Anyway, thanks if you made it this far. I was thoroughly surprised at how well this card performed, and would highly recommend it if you're looking for a card in this budget. Anyway, thanks again, and I hope you guys have a great day. Bye.